First of all, let me just say how thankful I am that you guys are taking this journey with me this year. I think the fact that you are reading through the whole Bible this year is unbelievable, it's amazing, and it will reap great benefits in your life. But the fact that you have chosen to do it with me, I'm truly grateful and humbled. I know that there are a lot of great resources online, and you guys could have chosen to do this in many ways. And the fact that you're doing it with me, I'm just truly grateful for that. Today we're going to cover Judges, Saul, and David. So starting out with Judges, you may have heard the verse before that kind of sums up the book of Judges. The verse that says, every man did what was right in their own eyes. So that's a pretty good verse to sum up Judges, and I'm going to go into a few more verses that I think also give us a clearer picture of what was going on. First of all, it was a 400-year period of time. So when you think about where you live right now, what was going on 400 years ago, it kind of gives you a concept of how long this period was. So this was after they had come into the promised land, the land that God had promised Abraham. Joshua had led them in and they'd taken over the Canaanite land. Mostly, there were still some Canaanites around that were causing them trouble in this period of time. But they didn't have a king yet. And so they were operating under the idea that God was their king. But they had these people that they called judges, or at least when we look back on it, we call them the judges that kind of led the people of Israel. So some of them were more like spiritual leaders, and some of them were more literally judges that settled disputes among the people, and some of them were more military leaders. And they didn't all even lead the whole nation. Some of them led just regions of the nation, and some of them more the whole nation. So it's really random because the word that this person was a judge and this person was judge, they might have served very different roles. But just think of it as mostly military leaders or people who led Israel in some way during this 400 period block of time. And so I'm not going to talk about all the ones that were mentioned, but I'm going to go through a few of them in just a minute. But first of all, early in this 400-year period of time, in Judges 3, it says that the Israelite people lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Ammonites, all of these ites, and they intermarried with them. Remember, we talked before about what God said about intermarrying with the people in the land. It wasn't that he was against international marriage, it was that he was against the people of Israel marrying people who served other gods. And he warned them, if you marry people who serve other gods, you will end up abandoning me. You will end up serving their gods. And that's exactly what we see happening. It says that they married their daughters, and their daughters were given in marriage to their sons, and the Israelites served their gods. When this would happen and they would serve other gods, they would remove themselves from the protection of God, and they would be oppressed by the nations around them. And when they were oppressed, it says in Judges 6, they cried out to the Lord because of Midian. This is just one of the nations that had oppressed them during this time. And God said, I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you. I drove out your enemies and I gave you their land. He's like, it was me. It wasn't these gods. They're new to you. It wasn't them. It was me who led you through the Red Sea and led you through the desert. It was me who gave you this land, who gave you vineyards you did not plant and gave you houses you did not build. It was me. Remember me. Don't forget what I did. And he says, I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live. But you have not listened to me. Remember all the way at Mount Sinai and over again, God has reaffirmed this if-then. If you follow me, you'll be under my protection and my provision, and things will go well for you. But if you abandon me and forget me, and you serve other gods, then you remove yourself from my protection. If you choose them, you get what they bring. If you choose me, you get what I bring. And over again, we see this cycle where they choose to serve the other gods and they get what those gods bring, which is exactly nothing. They cannot offer protection. And so on their own, Israel is not that strong. Their military is not that great, and they are oppressed by the nations around them. And they serve the images of Baal and Ashtaroth and Aram and City. Basically, if they learn about a new god, they're worshiping that god, and they're serving it. And they abandoned the Lord and no longer served him at all. So at first they're just mixing in the worship of other gods with the worship of God, but that leads to a total abandonment of God. The Israelites were in great distress. Finally, they cried out to the Lord for help, saying, "We have sinned, we've abandoned you, and we have served the Baal. Please help us." And the Lord replied, "Did I not rescue you from the Egyptians and the Amorites and the Ammonites and the Philistines and the Sidonites? And when they oppressed you, you cried out to me for help, and I rescued you." He's saying, remember what I've done for you. It was me. It wasn't these gods. Yet you have abandoned me and served other gods, so I will not rescue you anymore. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them rescue you in your hour of distress. You chose them. Go see what they have to offer. Go ask them for help. We see God saying that, saying, "I will not rescue you anymore." But the Israelites pleaded with the Lord, and they said, "We have sinned. Punish us as you see fit. Only rescue us today from our enemies." And then they put aside their foreign gods and they served the Lord. And then it says, "And the Lord was grieved by their misery." They have rejected him. They've abandoned him. They've put him aside. They have forgotten him. And when he looks down on them and he sees their misery, he can't bear it. And so he rescues them yet again. This God who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, what he saw affected him. And in one verse he's saying, "I'm not going to help you. Cry out to your new gods for help." But 2 verses later, he raises up a deliverer and he rescues them because he is grieved. His heart is stirred. He is affected by their misery. And he does this even though he knows that as soon as they get a little bit of relief from the suppression, they are going to abandon him again. This is the pattern we see over and over in the book of Judges for 400 years. If you have your timeline that looks like this, it's helpful if you kind of have that next to you when we're going through these. I didn't put all of the judges on the timeline. I put a couple that the story stuck out to me for one reason or the other. So we have Ehud, who stabs Eglon and the sword gets caught in the fat and he escapes out the window while Eglon's attendants think that he's in the bathroom. I don't know, I put that on there just because it's kind of funny. Then you have Gideon. If you've ever heard people talk about putting a fleece before the Lord, it's kind of a churchy way of saying I'm going to test the Lord and see if he's really speaking to me. It comes from this story when Gideon puts out this lamb's wool and sees if it stays dry or if it stays wet, and he's trying to test the Lord to see if God is really asking him to do what God is asking him to do. Gideon's also the one that whittles this large army down to just 300 men, and they stand around the camp of the Philistines and break their jars with the light inside, and they blow their horns, and the Philistines all kill each other. And so there's a great delivery through Gideon. Then we have Deborah. Deborah is awesome because she is a woman that God greatly uses in a spiritual way and in a military way. And it was under her leadership that they fought some Canaanites with the military leader was Sisera, and he goes into the tent of this woman named Jael, and she puts a tent peg to his head and kind of nails him to the ground. And so it's a crazy story. You also have a very disturbing story after that about Jephthah, and he is the one that he has great faith and says that he believes that God can deliver the people from the Ammonites. And so he goes off and he defeats them. That's the good side of the story. The disturbing part of the story is that he had promised that whoever comes back to greet him when he comes back from victory, that he would sacrifice him to the Lord. And it ends up being his daughter. And I'm sure you remember that story if you read it, because it's very disturbing. There are some theologians and commentators that believe that she wasn't actually sacrificed like a burnt offering, that she just was not able to marry and have children, and so she was sacrificed in that way. And other commentaries believe that she really was burnt as a burnt offering. If she was burnt as a burnt offering, one thing I am sure of is that did not honor God. Even the keeping of that vow, I do not believe honored God, because God makes it very clear in Deuteronomy that he detests the practice of the surrounding nations that burned their sons and daughters and fire to their gods. And God says, do not worship me the way they worship their gods, because I hate it. And so if Jephthah did do that, it wasn't honoring God, the vow, or even the keeping of the vow. It was dishonoring to God. The crazy thing is that he shows up in Hebrews 11 as a man of faith. I'm not really sure what to make of that, except for that even though he did something that was foolish and painful, this yucky story, that when God looks back on him, all that he is remembered for is that he had faith to defeat the Amorites. The same thing is true of us. We might make huge mistakes and do foolish things and yucky things, but when God looks at us, it has always been our faith and God that makes us righteous before him. It is Christ's righteousness in us and us putting our faith in that makes us righteous before God. And the same thing was true of him. Despite the yucky things he did, what is remembered about him is that he had faith that God could deliver him. Then we have Samson. Samson's kind of a weird one for me to try to figure out what to make of too. Because in a sense, he's a great hero of the Bible, right? He's often thought of as a hero of the Bible. And God does use him to deliver the people from a lot of Philistine oppression. Kills tons of Philistines. However, he seems more like a one-man show that most of the time when he kills Philistines, it's because he loses his temper and it's for personal reasons. And so you don't really see him leading an army of people. You see him just going out and killing a bunch of Philistines. And he does some really kind of yucky things, and he's got a prostitute and then another woman and then the wife that the whole thing is just kind of an odd story to make a hero of. But in any case, God's purpose for him was to deliver the people from the Philistine oppression, and he accomplishes that by killing a lot of Philistines in his life. Another very disturbing story towards the end of Judges is the one of the man and his concubine. That's very disturbing, the whole thing. Even the way, then when the Benjamites were reduced down to 600 men, the way that they get their wives is also disturbing. So the one thing to keep in mind about that story, though, is that it just kind of gives us a picture of the total depravity of a nation, of Israel, when they abandoned God. When they forgot God, this is what it led to. And so the tribe of Benjamin, one of the tribes of Israel, was reduced down to 600 men as a result of that whole disturbing story. We also see during this time of Judges, the book of Ruth happens. So this story about a Moabitess woman who ends up in Jesus' family tree, like she's in Matthew 1 as one of Jesus' ancestors. Only a few women are listed in Matthew 1. Mostly just the men are listed. But Ruth is one of the people mentioned in Jesus' genealogies in Matthew. And she's a Moabitess woman who chooses to side with God. God, once again, was not against intermarrying with the foreigners. He was against intermarrying with people who kept their gods. And she said to Naomi, your God will be my God. And so God honored that union. Her and Boaz got married. They had Obed. Obed had Jesse. Jesse had David. And David is the second king of Israel that we'll talk about in a minute here. So at the end of Judges, the very next period of time right after that is 1 Samuel. One leads right into the other. And in fact, the last two people that are considered judges are in the book of Samuel. So Eli is one, and then Samuel is the one. Samuel opens with a barren woman who God gives her a son, and she dedicates that son back to the Lord. He grows up in the temple, and that is Samuel. And Eli is the one that's kind of taking care of him at the temple. He is the priest there. Eli dies when he hears that his sons have died and that the ark has been captured by the Philistines. And so he falls over backwards and dies, and Samuel leads Israel for the next 40 years. When he dies, because the ark has been captured by the Philistines, the ark stays in the Philistine land for about 7 months. And during that time, God sends these tumors and these rats, and their god Dagon falls over in the temple in front of God. I think it's interesting that God not only was using these things to get the ark back to Israel, to show the Philistines that they weren't supposed to keep the ark, but God also was showing the Philistines that God had power over their false gods. Each of these things that God did in the Philistine land was pointing specifically to one of their gods, and God was being known. He was attempting to be known to the Philistines as the God of all gods by showing that their gods were powerless before him. So the ark comes back on a cart that the Philistines send it to Israel, and it says that 70 men opened it up and looked inside the ark, and then they died. And because of this, the people said, it's too hard to come near to the Lord. Like they blamed it on God and made it seem like it was some great mystery how to worship the Lord. Like we want to come near him and God is just too difficult. It's too mysterious how we can ever please him. Even though, come on, it was very clear in the law that you're not supposed to look in the ark. You're not supposed to touch it. Only priests are supposed to even come near it. Only the high priest once a year. So the fact that they were audacious enough to look into the ark and were killed, that's one thing. But the fact that then the people blamed God, like he just randomly killed these guys for no good reason, you see God getting blamed for stuff when the people were dishonoring him so completely, and yet they blamed it on him and said he was too hard to come near. So then Samuel's leading the people, and Samuel leads the people for, like I said, about 40 years, and then the people come to him and they say, we want a king. And Samuel says, you already have a king. God is your king. And they're like, yeah, we want a human king because we would like to have parades and a palace that we can visit and have parties. And so they want a human king. And Samuel goes and talks to God and says, yeah, I'm a little hurt. I've been leading them and they want a king. And God says, it is not you that they have rejected. It is me that they are rejecting. But go ahead and give them a king, and I will choose the king. So God chooses Saul, and he chooses from all tribes, he chooses Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. This tribe that had been reduced down to 600 men and had a bad reputation, God chooses the first king of Israel from that tribe and restores, redeems Benjamin back up to a place of honor. So Saul is the first king of Israel. The Bible says that God changed his heart. So here's Saul. He's a good-looking guy. God changes his heart and makes him a great king. And the Spirit of God came upon him, but yet his flesh was still strong, and he gave into the flesh on these occurrences where he didn't wait for Samuel. Man, he waited 7 days. The army was fleeing. I totally get it. It seems totally reasonable what Saul did, but when Samuel came, he said, you have not obeyed the Lord, and God's going to take the kingdom away from you. And it's hard for me to understand that what he did warranted that when we see much worse sins with David and other people. But I know that God knows the heart, and he can see way beyond what we can see in that story. Later, Saul doesn't sacrifice all of the animals he's supposed to kill everything, and he saves the cattle in another battle. And Samuel tells him again, the kingdom's going to be taken away from you and given to another family. And so Saul has this amazing son, Jonathan. He is an awesome hero. He is a great military guy, and he also seems to be really great spiritually. He seems to really trust and honor the Lord. But yet, God says the kingdom is not going to go to your son Saul, it's going to go to another. And that other ends up being David. So, David is first introduced to Saul when Saul has an evil spirit. And there's different theories about what that evil spirit means. And if you look those up in commentaries, you'll kind of find three different views on that. That either it was his own spirit within him that was evil, or that God's allowed Satan to send an evil spirit to torment him, or that God's angel was tormenting him. Not an evil spirit, but God's angel was tormenting him, and maybe it felt evil or something. But anyway, you can look that up if you're interested in that. At any rate, David is hired to play the harp for him, and that seems to soothe him. Later, David ends up killing Goliath, and then he ends up being a leader in Saul's army. And as you read, and as I'm sure you may remember if you grew up in the church, the women start chanting, Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000. Saul gets jealous, and so he tries to kill David. So David goes on the run. And this is a really cool story and a cool part of the Bible because it kind of reminds me of Robin Hood. Because here he is in trouble with the king, and so he flees, and he's like camping out and hiding in caves and such, and then it says that the disgruntled men, the people who are in trouble with the law or whatever, followed him. And there ended up being 600 men. And David just sort of kind of like Robin Hood. They're like going on raids, raiding the enemies of Israel, and just kind of living off the land. And thest men loved David. Even before David was on the run, Jonathan loved David and said, it was like his best friend ever. And Michal, which was Saul's daughter, also loved him. The people loved him. They chanted about him. Everyone seemed to love David. So I wonder what his personality was like, or like just kind of how he came across interpersonally, because he really seemed to inspire loyalty, devotion, and love from the people around him. And these 600 men, one of the things that they say is, David, son of Jesse, we are with you, heart and soul. So this group of, disgruntled and random men come together, and there's something that unites them. And what unites them is loyalty and love for David. They believe in him, and they'll follow him anywhere. Of those 600 men, there's 30 that are called the mighty men of David. And you read about some of their feats, some of the things that made them special. 3 of those were David's nephews, which was Joab, Abishai, and Ashiel. And Joab ends up being kind of David's main military leader as a king, but also kind of his frenemy. It's a really interesting relationship there. So they are out. They have a couple chances to kill Saul. They don't take it. And Saul ends up dying in a battle, and his son Jonathan dies also. And so temporarily his son Ishbosheth becomes king, and Ishbosheth gets killed. His general Abner unites with David. Joab kills Abner, and then David is the king, and Joab is the head of the army, and it goes from there. So early in David's reign, he decided to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. So remember, the ark had been captured by the Philistines, had been with them for 7 months. Now it had been 40 years at this guy named Abinadab's house, and David decided to bring it to Jerusalem. So they put it on a cart, and they start to bring it back to Jerusalem. And this guy named Uzzah reaches out to steady it when it was getting wobbly on the cart, and God strikes him dead. So they were not supposed to carry the ark on a cart. God had given them specific instructions that the ark, it is a holy thing and is to be carried on the shoulders of the priest with poles. And they put it on the cart. That's the way the Philistines had transported it the last time it had been transported. It is not the way that God had instructed them to carry this holy thing that represented God's presence. And when this happened, of course, David led the people in saying, oh God, we are guilty and we're sorry that we did this. No, that is not what David did. David, just like the people, remember back when the 70 guys had looked into the ark and they had died, all the people were like, who can come near God? Never mind, we won't move the ark, we'll just leave it where it is because God's too difficult to come near. David led the people to do the same thing here. David said almost the exact words as the people had said after that 70 had died. He said, who can come near the Lord then? Here's the difference with David though. He, 3 months later, after he had been honest about his disappointment with God and his anger towards God, he had processed these feelings and written about them, kind of journaled about them. 3 months later, he says this, God, you are innocent and we are guilty. It is through being honest with his feelings and processing his feelings with God, in relationship with God, that he realizes the truth, that God is not so difficult to come near. God had told them how to come near him. The problem isn't that God was being difficult and super mean. The problem is that the people were disobeying God, and David had led them in that. And so he takes responsibility for Uzzah's death, and they end up bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. Here are some other things about David. Remember how I said that God was connected forever with the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because he's often referred to as God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus is connected to David in this way. Jesus is referred to as Jesus, the son of David. So that makes him a pretty important character. Some of the things I love about David, there are so many things we can kind of pull out that are in the Psalms and in his story that make him a man after God's own heart. But I can just talk about a couple of them today. One is that he remembers God. After these years of human history that God has experienced, there is someone here now that remembers him. He remembers God's works. He constantly talks about the things that God has done for Israel and the things that he has done for David personally. He shouts it out. He declares it, that it is because of God that we have won this victory. It is because of God that we have this land. It is because of God that I am the king. He remembers what God has done and who he is. Also, David knows God, God's great desire to be known by people. David knows God. He constantly in the Psalms declares who God is. He talks about God's greatness and his power and his majesty, But he also talks about God's kindness and his gentleness. He seems to know and have experienced a wide spectrum of the characteristics of God, and he declares them. He also knows God on a personal level. There's one verse that he wrote that said that God is the lifter of my head. I think about that verse, and I have a picture in my mind of David, or of any of us, of a person being downcast and sad and discouraged, and their head is down. And God comes along and he cups his hands around the face of David and lifts it up and speaks words of encouragement and love. There's one verse that said that David encouraged himself in the Lord. And then later he says, the Lord is the lifter of my head. He experiences God lifting his head up and encouraging him. There's another place where it talks about, it says the Lord, it's talking about a righteous man, and then it says the Lord is the one who holds his hand. He experiences God holding his hand. This is God. He's the creator of the universe. And David feels like God holds his hand. David attributes other body parts to God too, that he experiences God. He knows that God sees him with his eyes and God hears him. Altogether, these are some of the things I found that David experiences of God. He talks about God's face, God's nostrils, God's ears, God's mouth, his feet, his wings, his eyes, his eyelids, his breath, his voice, his laugh, and God's gaze. These are things that David writes about that he's experienced of God. So if he has experienced God's eyes and nostrils and hands, it's like he knows God in a personal way where God seems real to him. God seems like a person to him, not just an abstract thought or a cloud in the sky, but something, a person that he knows. David remembered God, and David knew God. And the other thing I love about David is David delighted in God. He talks about delighting in God and God delighting in him. He knew that it was a relationship of joy and of gladness. There's a verse that says that in your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So he's holding God's hand. He says that God holds his hand. And in that hand, there are pleasures. He enjoys God. And during this time of David taking pleasure in God and God delighting in and taking pleasure in him, I'm going to read you some things that God hears. So I want you to close your eyes. Go ahead and close your eyes and try the best you can to get into sort of like the head of God. I know that's impossible, but imagine God standing in Israel and hearing these things. God hears this. You light my lamp. You deliver me. You satisfy me. You uphold me. You set me on high places. You train me. You give me everything I have. You enlarge my steps. You gird me with strength. You lift me up. You rescue me. You show me loving kindness. You lift my head. You answer me. You sustain me. You hear me. You've put gladness in my heart. You have made me dwell in safety. You bless me. You surround me forever. You maintain my cause. You have dealt bountifully with me. You have tried my heart. You have visited me by night. You drew me out of deep waters. You took me. You placed me. You restore my soul. You enlighten my eyes. You have given me my heart's desire. You have delighted in me. You have rewarded me. You illuminate my darkness. You gird me with strength. You make me lay down in green pastures. You lead me by quiet waters. You restore my soul. You guide me. You meet me with blessings. You set a crown upon my head. You gave me life. You place splendor and majesty on me. You make me blessed. You make me joyful. You are with me. You comfort me. You prepare a table for me. You have anointed me. You have healed me. You have brought up my soul. You have kept me alive. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken away my clothes of mourners, and you clothed me with gladness. You have seen my affliction. You have known the troubles of my soul. You have set my feet on a large place. You have kept me safe. You have shown me the wonders of your unfailing love. You have forgiven the guilt of my sin. You have preserved me. You have surrounded me with songs. You have delivered me from my fears. You have brought me up from the pit. You have put a new song in my mouth. You are pleased with me. You set me in your presence forevermore. You are near to me. Imagine God hearing those things. What was that like for him? David also said, "Oh Lord, I love you." When was the last time you expressed your love to the Lord? I know that our love is just so unworthy. Like, he loves us so much, and we can't even begin to love him the way he loves us. But do you think that because of that, he doesn't like hearing us say it? Do you think that he just knows our hearts so we don't have to say it? Or do you think that because our love isn't enough, then we shouldn't express it? What do you think God felt like when he heard David say over and over again, and sing with all of his might, and dance with all of his might before the Lord, and say, "Oh Lord, I love you"? What would it be like if he heard you say that? What would it be like if he heard you say that 10 times this week? What would it be like if he heard you say that 100 times this week? Oh Lord, I pray that when we speak words to you, that in addition to asking for the things we need and acknowledging who you are, God, I pray that we would say things that delight your heart. I pray that we would say things to you that bring joy to you. Oh God, you love us so much. And oh Lord, we love you.